Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Welcome back to the show. I am Clarence Fisher, and today, this week, we got a very, very, very special guest, best-selling author of the new book, Foundations for Liberty, Mr. Matthew Moore. Had a chance to sit down and chat with him, not only about the book, but about how he sees this thing that we call liberty. See, Matthew himself, he's a successful business owner, speaker, TV producer. I see him lead in the community, and he believes, I see it. He feels like the world is full of this unlimited possibility. And some people call him an idealist. Some other people call him unrealistic. But one thing I know for sure, if you're going to do something great in the world, first you have to see what the world could be, not necessarily what it is. And he embodies that. So wanted to bring him onto the show to, number one, say, hey, man, I see what you're doing. Been a fan for a long time, far away, so it was really cool to be able to actually catch him, sit down, and have this conversation about his brand new book, Foundations for Liberty, and you're going to enjoy it too. Here we go. All right, Matthew Moore, welcome to the show. How are you?
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Clarence.
Man, I'm so glad that you took time to speak to me. The topic that we have today is something that is heavy for me, and I know it's going to be heavy for the audience. As I'm looking around at, I was reading, I think it was either USA Today, even the New York Times was talking about how liberty is not the same today as it was in years past. Do you feel like that's a trend that's been happening?
Yes, I absolutely do feel like that's a trend that's been happening. And if you talk to, and this is what I love about this topic, is whether it's a Democrat, Republican, or somebody in the middle, wherever your spectrum is, there's certain liberties and there's certain freedoms that I think we all hold dear and that we really want to protect. And I think a lot of us can look at what's going on now or what's happened in the past and go, something's not right. We really aren't where we probably should be or where we were. Or maybe you feel like some freedoms are threatened. So, yeah, I completely agree with that assessment.
Yeah, well, I see it as well. I mean, before we start talking about, fixing, and I'll do the air quote America. I mean, what do you think that, and you mentioned that we kind of go at each other's throats. We're entrenched in what we feel and what we believe. I mean, what do you think that Americans need to do in order to begin fixing ourselves?
I think we really got to get back to our roots. And if you look at the founding of our country and the founding documents, I mean, much of it was centered around this idea of character and virtue and how each person had to take a level of personal responsibility in our own lives of character and virtue. Because even when Benjamin Franklin was asked, when they had finished, the Constitution and it was going through its ratification process and everything was basically coming to a close. Here we are, we had this new federal government and Benjamin Franklin is walking and he's interrupted by two people. I think it was two women. And they basically said, hey, doctor, what did you give us? A republic or a monarchy? And he goes, a republic, if you can keep it. And I really feel like, many of the founders had this idea that, yes, we're going on this grand experiment, but in order to do this grand experiment, there's certain principles, values, and beliefs that I think that the majority of the culture has to sustain in order for that freedom or that republic to even last. So I think we need to go back to asking the question, like, what were those principles? What was that character and virtue that they talked about? And what was the life and breath of our founding documents? Because I really feel like we've kind of gone far from those ideas.
thus the foundations for liberty. And so in your book, you discuss freedom for all, and I'm curious, to you, like, what does that mean? I mean, can you walk me through how that works? Because we all say that we have that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think we all intuitively know, like in our hearts, that that we have been granted freedom, and really where I think the difference comes is, people either define that freedom as being given by the government or being given by God himself or the creator or even nature itself, if you're not religious. And that's the cool thing about these principles is, the founding fathers, they had similarities, but they weren't all in one accord in everything. And many of them were believers. Many of them were, Christians or believed in God or believed in this fundamental truth that, there are laws and principles that even in nature were inherently given to us, and the liberties of life, liberty, freedom, as far as the pursuit of happiness, the ability to own property. I mean, these were all ideas that the founding fathers, held dear and felt like, hey, these things belong to us. They were given to us. They can't be taken from us. And so if you assert, a higher power, whether it's, nature's God or God himself, it's like you can't have government take those freedoms that inherently were given from you because they didn't come from the government in the first place. And I think it comes down to, this idea of the non-aggression principle. Much of what's in my book is centered around this idea. And that idea is simply this, it's the belief system that individuals should be free to act as they choose, with the exception that they may not initiate force or the threat of force against any other person or their property. And if you boil it down, it's basically the golden rule. I mean, we've all grown up hearing the golden rule, but we typically don't ask the question of like, am I supporting a candidate or am I supporting a policy that's requiring force upon somebody else's life, property, liberty, pursuit of happiness? Like, what kind of ideas am I upholding and pursuing that may be morally not right when it comes to the non-aggression principle? Because I mean, I think we would all say, oh yeah, it's not right to steal stuff from your neighbor. It's not right to kill somebody. It's not right, to do all these things that violate the non-aggression principle. So then we have to ask the question, if it's not right, what makes it right for a third party to do it? Like, why hire a hitman to go hold your neighbor at gunpoint and say, hey, I need you to give to the less fortunate and to the broken in order to make this world a better place? Like, to me, it doesn't really make sense. And even if you're a Christian, I mean, Jesus calls us as individuals to be the church, to go serve people and love people in a very personal and individual manner. He didn't say, hey, go overtake Rome and use the government to, spread this idea. He met people where they were and developed relationships with them and pursued them in love. And so what I do in the book is I take a lot of theological approach, along with these ideas of liberty and the founding ideas of our country. And I kind of correlate them and I show how all of this kind of streams together and how, there is a formula and there is a secret to being free, living free, and being good stewards of ourselves and of our freedom. Because ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Is if we're not good stewards, it's like, hey, if you don't govern yourself, somebody's going to step in and try to govern you. So let's step up to the plate.
There are two things that you said there that, and I'll break these down into two different questions because you brought up a couple of things. One of the things so you brought in the church, and you believe that there's this widespread kind of misunderstanding of the idea of the separation of church and state, right? Yeah,
no, I do. And sometimes I even see it with, the right and the left. So it's the left is very adamant a lot of times to say, hey, we can't have any mention of the word God. We can't have any, reading of the scriptures. We can't, anything that has to do with a creator. It has no place in a government building or a government function. And on the extreme, you've got sometimes people on the right, which they may be well-intentioned, but they're essentially trying to take their way of life and they're trying to take their beliefs and their convictions and forcing them on other people through force, which in reality, we probably shouldn't be doing that. We should be living instead by an example, educating, inspiring. We should doing it on a very personal manner instead of trying to force people to swallow the gospel. And I think where the ground is that should be stood upon, which is where our founders were, was religious liberty for everybody. Now, that doesn't mean that, it's going to be forced on people, but it also doesn't mean that it's going to be completely void. And it seemed perfectly when Jefferson and Madison, even in their own state governments, while the Constitution was being created a year prior, they had made it the law of the land of their state, and they got it through their state legislature, that essentially what's written in the First Amendment was to be law in their state. And so then the following year, you see, this idea in the First Amendment, and I'll actually read the First Amendment to you here, so that way you guys can understand where this is all at. I mean, you guys have all heard this, so. But it says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it's this idea that religion is something that we owe, it's a duty that we owe to our Creator, and in the manner that we exercise that or discharge that, it really comes down to our own convictions and not by force or violence. I'm obviously, you could tell I'm not a proponent of force or violence, but I think where the misinterpretation of these ideas, that everybody could be free to worship as they see fit, whether they believed in a God or not. We started to see the interpretation of this idea of separation of church and state, which I might mention was not actually in any of our founding documents other than a note or a letter that was written in response to the Danbury Baptist Association. They had written to Thomas Jefferson because they were under persecution in their own state government, because back then state governments, they actually had favorites, like certain taxes were going to fund different denominations. And so there was a lot of persecutions, whether it be Catholics or Baptists. And really what the founders did when they set up the Constitution at the federal level was say, hey, listen, if the power to legislate morality at all, if it even existed, it should be done at the state level. And the federal government cannot do anything to persuade, that or those outcomes in the state governments. And so essentially what Thomas Jefferson was doing, because the Danbury Baptists, they were writing to him complaining like, hey, can you either help us with this? And can you also promise that you won't enact anything at the federal level that would discriminate against us? And Thomas Jefferson was basically saying, hey, listen, I can't help you, but I can see with great satisfaction that if you guys resolve this in your own state legislature, that the ideas that that we all hold dear, can come to fruition in your state government, just as it has with the will of the people at the federal government. So he was basically stating that there's a wall of separation between state and government, that the acts of the government were applied to actions only, and not necessarily these ideas in religion. And so he. I think people misinterpret that, and especially with some of the Supreme Court rulings, they took Thomas Jefferson's letter and they misinterpreted it, basically saying that even the mention of God or the reading of Scripture is not, you cannot do that in a public school or in a public place. It's there's no problem for Scriptures to be read or for a prayer to be given, so long as there's no law either for or against it. And that's the trick, is like you can't be for or you can't be against it. So, as long as somebody has the option to exempt themselves, then everything is kosher. And that's where I plead with the church is like, hey, listen, our founding fathers, they understood that there were ideas and principles that were going to make this republic last and be strong. And those principles are essentially found in the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. and those all come from a relationship with God. And so, especially when you look at the writings of Washington and you see, John Adams, they're talking about, hey, we truly believe that a moral people, a right people, living out a faith, in God, in the Creator, in the Judeo-Christian values, was very important to the sustaining of our country. But it was going to be up to the people. It was going to be up to society and culture to maintain that. And because, the founding fathers, when they were setting up our government, they understood the favoritism that was played at the state governments. And they also understood the religious persecutions of many of the people that came to the continent of America because they were trying to escape a monarchy or a theocracy or a combination of the both. And the last thing that the American founders wanted was a theocracy or a monarchy in the United States. But they understood that those values and principles needed to be expressed and cherished and, kept strong in the society without, government playing favorites.
That's excellent. Thank you. Going back to the non-aggression principle that you brought up, do you find, because when I listen to you and I hear and I check, and as I'm checking out the book, I'm thinking I see you navigate through so many different audiences in your role as president of Young Businessmen of Tulsa. Does that principle help you to relate to all the different types of business owners that you interact with?
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's a business owner, whether it's, somebody that I just meet on the street, somebody of a different political affiliation, that idea, that principle is really, what can be seen in the Christian faith. And so I try to, when I meet people, I just meet them where they're at and I listen and I try to understand, but I'm not going to necessarily force my ideas. I might ask questions to prompt conversation. But at the end of the day, I'm not trying to force my way of life. I'm not trying to force my ideas on anybody. I'm literally just saying, hey, here's how I live. This is why I think it works. Here's the evidence of why, it stands out to me. Take it for how you want it. Because ultimately, especially as the Christian, it's our job to, I'm a Christian. I know you're a Christian, Clarence. And I would say that, it's our job to love people, to meet people where they're at, to, live by example, to inspire others. And it's really the Holy Spirit's job to work in people's lives to change them. It's our job to share the gospel, but it's the Holy Spirit is the one who ultimately performs the change.
That's great. So as I spoke about, I brought up YBT. I hope that's okay.
Oh yeah.
And that pulls us into this kind of business realm. And when I think of business, I think about money. I think about capitalism. And in your book, you also mention monetary sovereignty. What does that mean? Yeah.
So a lot of times, a lot of people, and that's the funny thing is even among business people, we all know how business works. We all know how to get financing. We know how to do all these things, but a lot of us haven't had this conversation about what actually is money, what gives it value, and what defines it. And ultimately, if you really do look at it, money is essentially just a representation. It's a tool or a vehicle that represents our time, energy, freedom, and wealth. And the reason why I put these chapters in the book was because if we're going to talk about the foundations for liberty, if we're going to talk about what it means to really be free and self-governing and living with character and virtue, we have to have the ability to do so. And we have to have full charge over our time, over our energy, over our freedom, and over our wealth. So money really is a foundational part of freedom. And I think that, when you look at what's truly scarce in this world, the truly is the most scarce thing in this world is our time and our energy. And we only have so much time and energy. And so if the tool that we're using to represent those things is compromised and is weakened or is not sound, then it is an unjust system, and it is something that is robbing us. But a lot of us don't understand it or even know it. And we just go blindly throughout our day, not even asking that question. When in reality, when you look at even our founding documents, I mean, our founding fathers understood the importance of sound and hard money and monetary sovereignty, either as a nation and as an individual. They experienced hyperinflation with the continental dollar when they were fighting the British. And that's why we came up with this term of, it's not worth a continental. Paper money historically, no matter where it's been tried, has always failed. And the average lifespan of a fiat currency, which is paper money backed by nothing, declared by the government, the average lifespan is 27 years. Rarely do they go beyond 50 or 70 years. And so when the founders set up our government, they wrote in the Constitution that, in Article 1, Section 10, it says the states shall not coin money, emit bills of credit. They can only make gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debts. And so just based on that alone, I would argue that the taxes being collected by state governments in Federal Reserve notes are not even constitutional because they're no longer backed by gold and silver. And the Constitution states real clearly that they can only collect gold and silver as a payment of debts. And that's why even when you look at what it used to be, it's like, yeah, the dollar used to be a measurement of gold and silver. But why was that? It's because gold was rare. It was limited in supply. It put restraints on the government. They couldn't just print this stuff into existence. They couldn't just inflate, their way out of stuff. They couldn't pay for unnecessary wars or social programs that were unaffordable by just, printing a bunch of money, which ultimately is a invisible tax or theft on the people, and so, when you talk about money and currency, they're two totally different things. And what we use today is a currency because it truly has no real store of value. I mean, every year that passes, their goal, especially the Federal Reserve has stated this, that, 2% inflation is their goal. So basically what that means is every year your dollar loses 2% of its purchasing power. So what are you doing to counterbalance that? What are you doing to protect yourself? It's like, you look at since 1913, since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. And then in just the last 6 months, we've created over, $6 trillion. We've created more money in the last year than what has been in existence in all of our country's history. So, I mean, we're at the end game when it comes to fiat money. And there will be some monetary changes and shifts coming in the future. So I try to waken people to that and say, hey, listen, this is kind of important for your freedom. This is kind of important for your time and energy. Let's talk about money and what that really means.
Wow. And it really is. I did not know about the 27 years.
Yeah.
But I mean, man, that makes sense. So at the time, right now, at the time that we're recording this, we see, I mean, people are, money is flocking back to gold, silver as kind of a chaos hedge, but then also cryptos. I mean, what do you feel like? So where do we need to go? I mean,
I'm not going to give necessarily financial advice, but I can tell you what I'm doing. What I'm doing is, obviously, having things that create cash flow are great. I mean, that's the first step. You want to have cash flow. Once you have, these vehicles of cash flow, you want to take some of that cash and put it in things that are going to sustain their purchasing power, that are going to sustain value. I mean, to hedge yourself against inflation, that's why people are running towards gold and silver and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. It's because they truly are limited in nature once you understand how they work and where they come from. And so I think in the coming days, we're going to see more and more of that. I have been, collecting and acquiring and putting, capital in these assets, since 2009 when I, started watching all these bailouts during the Great Recession. So I think at the end of the day, once this bubble of liquidity continues to grow and grow and grow worldwide, because I might mention this is the first time in human history that a fiat money system has ever been done globally at the same time by every country. There is no refuge. There is no safe haven. So like back in, for instance, when Zimbabwe, when their dollar crashed, or when their currency crashed through hyperinflation, people started using dollars. They started using, whatever they could get their hands on that were better than the currency that they were using. Well, if the dollar's destroyed, or if the, the pound or the euro or any of these go into hyperinflation. I mean, we're going to have some major issues. And so I think we will have some kind of an economic monetary reset when it comes to how to deal with the debt, because ultimately money is a faith and confidence game. Once people lose confidence in what's going on, then it's game over, and people will resort to other forms of money. But in the meantime, there's a thing called Gresham's law. People will hoard that money that will sustain its value and will keep in circulation the money that loses value. I mean, because why would you want to hang on to something that loses value? You're going to spend it as fast as you can, and then you're going to hang on to the stuff that actually increases in value or stays stable in value. So it's going to be an interesting time, Clarence. That's for sure.
Very. So you talk about back in 2009, and that's going to, I mean, we've talked about a little bit about some of the various topics that you cover in your book, Foundations for Liberty. What is it that led you to write this?
So ultimately, what happened was these ideas have been percolating in my head for a long time, but I was just naturally, one night I would be inspired and I would sit down and I'd write something, and I was like, oh, I have 10 pages. And then like 3 months later, I got inspired again and I would write something, and then I'm like, oh, I've got 8 pages, and so then, a collection of doing this for 2 years, I was like, oh, I've got enough to create a book. And so I put it in a book format, and, it's always been my goal to write a book, but I didn't sit down with this material and say, I'm going to write a book. It was just like, I was inspired. So I put it on paper and then was like, hey, I've got a book. And, I think for this day and age, with such a political divide, with such chaos, I think it is appropriate, to get back to our these founding ideas, things like the non-aggression principle, things like, what our founding fathers talked about, and then even rediscovering what it means to have, good and sound money, because that's a big part of preserving our freedom, whether it be nationally or whether it be personally. So, I just think it's all timely, and I contribute that to the work of God and just His inspiration in my life.
It really is a great read and a great book. I appreciate you putting it out there. What do you think that readers should come away from it with?
I want readers to walk away with, hey, here's a set of ideas, here's a set of principles. Whether you like it or whether you hate it, it's a conversation starter. And I want you to share it with friends and family, and I want you to, talk about it, but I don't want you to talk about it in a hostile way. Instead, I encourage people, even in the book, I encourage them to say, find those freedoms and those values that you hold dear and try to meet somebody in the middle. Find some common ground based on stuff that you guys believe in. Because I was having a conversation with somebody who was, far left, and we actually had a great discussion about criminal justice reform. And it was like, we weren't arguing with each other. We weren't hating on each other, but because I took the time to actually find out what freedoms and what principles were important to them, I was like, okay, well, I can definitely relate to that and I can get behind this idea. And so I really explored that. And that really created a bridge of trust and a bridge of understanding. And it kind of brought down the walls. So I think in such a divided time, I would encourage people to use this material and these ideas as a conversation starter to meet people where they're at.
That is great. I was going to ask, what do you feel people should be doing after they hear this? But I think that's it. Start the conversations.
Yeah.
All right. So how can we find out more about Matthew Moore and get a copy of Foundations for Liberty?
Well, it's a Kindle format and in paperback on Amazon. And you can also go to mattjmoore.com. That's Moore with 2 O's, mattjmoore.com. And there you can find all my social media links and all the crazy stuff that I'm involved in.
Man, Matt, thank you for taking the time to share with us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.